I'm very pleased to welcome you here for our first Marx Issues Forum of this academic year. And we have a very topical program today, looking at China trade particularly, and if we have time, looking at some cybersecurity issues as well. Let me, before I begin, note particularly the arrival of the president of the Baruch College Fund, Helen Mills. We're delighted to have you here this morning, Helen. And I'm particularly delighted to have with us this morning to talk about these issues two people who have spent their lives looking at a combination of international business and international security issues. In the order listed on your program today, Nicholas Eftimiades, on my far right, joins us today from Penn State Harrisburg, where he is in the School of Public Affairs. Nicholas has had a long career in intelligence, most notably with the CIA, the U.S. Department of State, and as a senior intelligence officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency. He's held many roles in that regard, including the chief of counterterrorism operations, of the Transnational Issues Division, of the Future Division, and of the Space Division. So he can talk to us today about how this looks on the ground from a life lived in intelligence services. Professor Lilac Nachum, to my immediate right, is our colleague in the Zicklin School of Business. She is a fellow of the Academy of International Business and part of the leadership team of the Africa chapter of the Academy. She has spent a long career looking at international business issues, which of course puts her squarely in the question of how the current tariff regime is affecting our prospects, specifically with regard to China, but also more globally in a literal and figurative sense with regard to U.S. trade. Nicholas, Lilac, welcome. Wonderful to have you here today. Let's get right into it. So we're in the midst of what some people describe as a trade war. I wonder if you could each give a sense of what a trade war is and what this one in particular looks like. What distinguishes what we see happening right now? Lilac, why don't we begin with you?
Yeah, okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good to see the faces I know and meet those I don't. So trade war. Trade war, in a way, it's not very different from what we're seeing government do always, which is interfere in the market-driven patterns of trade. All governments do this to certain degrees. And but the trade war is an escalation of this, and it has the distinctive feature that it turns to feed itself up, because you did this for me, so I will do for you. So, and as we're seeing, the tariffs are going up and up and up, and the restrictions are falling on us from each direction, and it sort of becomes self-perpetuating. So that's the essence of trade war. But in essence, what they do is they distort the natural patterns of trade that would be dictated by the principle of comparative advantage, that everybody specializes at what they do best, and everybody benefits from that. So this is a very, very basic stuff that I teach my students in undergrad, in our undergrad courses. But by interfering in those patterns, government distort the natural pattern as dictated by the comparative advantage by the principle of comparative advantage. We know, although this is not what we hear, you know that everybody loses by interference of trade in any kind, surely of that magnitude that we are seeing now in the so-called trade war. Now, what sets this one apart from others is that the bilateral trade relationship between the US and China are the world's largest. So as such, they are very significant by themselves. They, of course, have big repercussions for the rest of the world. Maybe more for the rest of the world than for the two economies involved, because given the size of both the US and China, the impact of trade by itself on our economies is fairly small, much, much smaller than it is compared to most of countries in the world that have much smaller economies. We know the main driver of our economy is our internal forces. We're less trade dependent for our growth and our development. And the same goes to China, although to a lesser extent. But the repercussions of that are, of course, very, very big, given the size and magnitude of that. So,
terrific. Thanks for starting us off here. Nicholas, please feel free to pick up, but let me just refine the question in two ways. President Trump, on the campaign trail and after assuming office, argued that China had already interfered in market forces with currency manipulation, with direct investment in state industries, with theft of intellectual property, et cetera. What's your take on that aspect of this particular contretemps? Were they justifiable, and is this the right kind of response?
Well, I think, were they justifiable? I mean, the president is saying that, yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that there's an issue with that. I mean, other than on the Chinese side at the negotiating table, where they flatly deny ever doing it. I mean, quite literally, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases and examples that have gone through our judicial system of intellectual property theft. We can actually chart this to some degree, 360 billion at a low end per year in U.S. losses. We can see the failure of U.S. industries as a result, partially the steel industry, the solar panel industry, solar turbines. You know, we're all due, faults in the U.S. industry, which has its impacts, and I see that from Penn State in Pennsylvania, in actual jobs on the ground. And that can be, traced to China's intellectual property theft. Current estimates are that it's 8% of China's GDP. So if you look at the European Union, they say about 80% of all the fake goods come from China. United States, that's 87%, Canada, 82%. So this is a global issue in those levels of intellectual property theft. And when that happens over a period of decades, at some point, a nation state says, hey, this is unfair. We can calculate, we can see the losses that are going on. And that's just one component, intellectual property theft. And there's, government subsidies and all the others, that coercive trade practices, all those that, if you will, this trade war is laying at China's doorstep. But it's not something that wasn't predicted, if you will. I mean, we had these debates in Washington 20 years ago. And the multiple sides thought on how China would react over long term. And there was a running theme in Washington, and there has been for decades, that eventually they'll comply. They'll run into the battery of international lawyers and accountants that says, no, you can't do business this way. You have to start to fall into a world's pattern of doing good business with these business standards. What we're seeing now is the actual friction point where that's happening.
So is intellectual property the big issue here, and have tariffs been in any way effective in trying to wrap arms around the issue? Veronique Dirugi reminded us in the New York Times this morning that 5 of the president's major promises with trade, that it would be short, that it would be easy to manage, that it would change the balance of trade instantaneously, et cetera, have not come true, and in fact, exactly the reverse seems to have happened in each one of these cases. Can you compare then the status quo ante, prior to the imposition of tariffs, to where we are now and give a sense of who's benefiting?
Something that is very often being overlooked in these tariffs is that in a global world, it's not very clear who benefits and who are the winners and who are the losers of putting tariffs. So Donald Trump meant to harm the Chinese producers, but to lump together with them all our American companies that are producing in China in order to sell what is produced there back in the United States. And we poor American consumers pay the price for the tariffs, because all our companies earn less depending on what they decide to do with the higher cost that they're confronted. But a lot of the import that we are getting from China is us selling to us, so to speak. Yeah, right. It's U.S. companies producing in China, selling back to the United States. That amount for a large part of China's export, our import from China. So it's really not very clear that this is effective, and that we are really treating the cause with treating the issue with the right medicine, so to speak. Yeah. So I'm not at all sure that this is going to have any effect on what Donald Trump wants to achieve. Yeah.
So I think that there are a couple of questions that one has to ask, not the least of which Trump has to ask, is what the threshold level of pain is for China. Now, in my experience, and I did my undergraduate and graduate there, I've been a China hand for my entire life, tours. So I think you're going to find it's fairly high on particularly the ruling class, the Chinese Communist Party. They've been through quite a lot over their 70-year existence and even more over the civilization's 4,000 plus year of existence. So they can tolerate quite a fair amount of pain, which I don't think this administration clearly understands. I've spoken to a few of the trade reps and briefed them on this and negotiating tactics, and they look at it a lot more short term. As I've said, this is sort of the first volley in something that's going to go on for the next 10 years. Okay? It's just step one. And this trade war is just one component of how the relationship has to be shaped. I mean, there are all these other issues such as Chinese companies not following standard accounting, not opening their accounting on the stock exchange and things like that are just in some senses appalling, but because you don't know what you're investing in. And so there are a lot of mechanisms that the United States has in addition to just this trade discussion. I don't think China has a unspoken agreement with its population at this point, which is you don't challenge political authority, and everyone does well. And as evidence, we've pulled 400 million people out of abject poverty. That's the unspoken agreement that exists in China today. So the question is, if that economy starts to go further south, starts to slow down even more, which is predicted even without the trade war, at what point do we see something more than the current 200,000 protests a year that we already see in China? And at what point does that start to threaten political control? So these are the issues that are actually at stake, and a trade war is just one fundamental component of that.
Okay, Lilac, you wanted to get?
Yeah, I think just to elaborate on this, to the pain point that Nicolas spoke about, I do think that China is very sensitive, exactly for the issues that Nicolas suggested. That it needs to deliver growth, and it needs to deliver better life prospects and living standards to its population in order to maintain its political power. And it seems from everything that they do that that's the major driving force that dictates almost everything that they do. So to put the pressure on this, it is a very, very sensitive point in China, very sensitive. If things start to shake up because of the trade war, I don't know how much room for maneuver the Chinese government has. So far, they have enough money to get around this and to prevent the bad consequences of this for the economy. But
the levels of debt are coming up tremendously.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but their debt is piling up too. Right. Yeah, I mean, this is not finite what they have there. So I do think that there is a very, very sensitive issue here for China that I think that's what Trump is trying to capitalize on. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no question. It's a very, very pinpointed attack in that sense.
Well, let's stick with this logic of the pain point, which to a certain extent buys into the logic of the trade war, right? I inflict pain on you, you inflict pain on me in return. We battle it out until one of us hurts too much and says uncle, right? So let's think about that right now. In the United States, we're seeing massive losses in U.S. farming. We're seeing lots of secondary supply markets going south at speed. You talked earlier, Nicolas, about the shift of solar panel production, although there are rare earth natural advantages that we might argue for China in that case as well. Can you begin to tote up the domestic impact here and the domestic impact in China and give a sense of recognizing that there are different levels of sunlight on the basic data about economic performance? Can you begin to tote up who's feeling it harder right now?
Well, I don't think there's any question. If this is going to be, the United States is going to sneeze and China's catching pneumonia at the end of the day. I mean, we're going to suffer a bit, but as the president, which was a pretty smart move politically, turns around and says, all the money that we've collected off tariffs, we're going to put back into the same targeted farming industries, which China did, to affect President Trump's voter base, which is extraordinary if you think about it. Just the fact that we have a country overtly saying, basically, we're going to go after your voter base, and overtly interfere in your elections and try and impact your voter base as hard as possible. And the counter move to that, and what the president is saying is yes, and we are taking that $15 billion that we're taking in tariffs, and we are putting that right back into the economy in the areas. So I think if you take a scan of U.S. businesses, Apple being a different situation, okay? But what you're going to find is the short-term impacts on bicycles and things like that that are coming out of China have risen. No question about that. At this point, U.S. industries are saying tolerable but not destructive. That seems to be the running line across the board. The question on everyone's mind is what's next? At what step next? What step goes next? China's case is a little more difficult to assess only because of the opaqueness in some components of their economy, but clearly that they're hurting as well in everything from construction. I mean, they're tremendous overcapacities that they've had, from slowdowns. Internally in businesses and job employment, that is hurting as well. You've seen their entire economy level off and moving downwards out of this. And although the trade war is not the fundamental component of that, it is certainly not assisting, is not helping in any way, shape, or form. I actually, to get back to what you said earlier, is that if you just take the isolated aspect of the trade war, right, and it's a 5-to-1 ratio on what the U.S. is sending out by getting in, right? So we're always going to be able to tax tariff more than they are. So, I mean, that's one limiting component, but the real extraordinary impact is probably on the rest of the world, which has an impact on global markets and in turn on the overall elements of economic growth. But those are going to be huge deals. And for the negative as well as positive for other countries that take advantage, Southeast Asia is going to rise dramatically because U.S. businesses are worried about that and moving out of Southeast Asia or moving into Southeast Asia as a result. So it's not just a U.S. and China impact, but global.
I think in terms of the consequences of this, a lot of what we are seeing are processes that started before the trade war began and without any relation to the trade war. And the trade war is just accelerating them and speeding them up. A lot of them are very good and healthy. So to start with China, actually, the low-cost jobs have started to leave China long before the trade war. And we have been hearing about that for years. And China deliberately doesn't want to have them. Yeah, it's very, very explicit that it doesn't want to be the factory of the world anymore. It wants to become the innovation center of the world. And that doesn't go together with production of garments and shoes, obviously. Yeah, so China doesn't want to have that in China. So that is accelerating. The Chinese are also very explicit in wanting to be generate growth from within rather than being export dependent for its economic growth as a way of lifting up the middle class and again delivering the contract that Nicholas mentioned, that it has the unspoken about contract that they have with the population. Yeah, we will deliver growth, but you will give us the political power. So China has started doing that also without the trade war. And that goes to the impact on the rest of the world. Vietnam has been benefiting from that for quite a while, and some other Southeastern countries, and even Africa, Ethiopia is becoming a center for production of garment and so on. So, so those things have happened. Now, on our part, American companies have started to move back production from China. The part of the production, exactly the part of the production that is now hurt by the trade war, the part of the production of the things that were meant to be sold in the U.S. back before the trade war started, for two reasons. One is again the labor cost and rising in China, so it made less sense. The lack of alternative for many of those activities elsewhere, because China, although labor costs are rising, it provides the entire supply chain. This is the advantages of size that China has that are very hard to replicate in any other of the Southeastern Asian countries. They're not available in Vietnam. They're surely not available in Bangladesh, in all those alternative places, in Thailand. And they started to move back in large part because of the growth of automation and the changing in the factor intensity in the production and the replacement of capital by labor by capital. So those processes have just been accelerated as a result of the trade war. I'm not sure that they're bad at all. They're negative in this regard at all. So yeah, we need to put this in proportion.
Both of you have begun to pivot away from the bilateral relationship, looking at the larger context of trade. And I wonder if you could look a little bit at some of the non-trade war actions of both countries, particularly with regard to multilateral efforts, such as the Belt and Road Initiative out of China, such as almost exactly the reverse, the cancellation of the TPP, the celebration of bilateral agreements. Both Mr. Navarro and Mr. Lighthizer are suggesting that bilateral relationships are easier to manage. True at one level, but when everybody else is doing multilateral relationships, that poses a bit of a difficulty. Starting with you, Nicholas, can you talk a little bit about how BRI fits into all of this?
Sure.
And how that contrasts with a sharply different direction in U.S. policy absent China per se right now?
Well, let's look at BRI for a moment. So the Belt and Road Initiative, which was called the One Belt Initiative, or still is referred to that way in China, was actually a move on the part of the Chinese government to start to get rid of overcapacity, which people don't realize. And it was really pretty brilliant. They provided low-cost loans to any number of nations. They got rid of their excess production capacity, to those nations, and those nations paid back the loans, or and if they couldn't pay back the loans, they lost some elements of sovereignty or product. Sri Lanka, some of the ports that are evolving now in Africa as well, Abidjan. So it was a really sort of brilliant way of getting rid of your over 500,000 in excess capacity now moving out. And however, it's got very mixed reviews as a result of that, because much of the local populations, particularly in Africa, thought they were going to be the benefit of the jobs, that it was going to be employing locals. It turns out, no. Yeah, they do benefit from all the sales that they have with that, but there's an increased Chinese presence to actually do those jobs, the overcapacity component of it. So there's a lot of friction that's resulted in that. The other part of that is the contractual nature and their opaqueness, so no one knows, what the nature of the contracts are, who's been paid. Those aren't exposed publicly. And so there are a lot of accusations globally about corruption in this regard. We have the same thing, even the European Union comments. When China talks about this BRI, and I thought this was a great quote coming out of Brussels, and they talk about it being a win-win, that means China wins twice. So there's a lot of caution on that initiative as a whole. So yet, countries will say, and they haven't, I can tell you at some very senior levels. We've been through Africa a lot, and they say to the U.S., you know what? You've done nothing for us. China's at least putting money into the economy, bottom line. So from the perspective then, it's been a very successful engagement. It also has political, it's like having the benefit of having good relationships with foreign countries, but not having to do that, because you have an effect of power and giving out money, which is the position that the Chinese government does. So there's a political dynamic to this as well in their Belt and Road Initiative. On the other side, I believe the EU, as well as the US and Japan, have now put together joint funds, to try and counter the Belt and Road Initiative a bit, and to at least offer an option for funding internal infrastructure projects.
Far smaller in size.
Yeah, far smaller in size. So we're seeing this dynamic lay out. There's no question China's expanded its global influence and its reach, and countries have benefited under that. So BRI and that component of it, and the U.S. and its, if you will, allies, which is a tough term these days, because the president has moved us towards very much bilateral and America first thinking, which I spent years negotiating treaties, right? Open Skies treaties, several other ones for State Department, and then detailed over to Defense Threat Reduction Agency, et cetera. I'm not too sure that's a bad direction to go, because we do, I will tell you, in treaties, to get taken advantage of a lot. There's a lot of expectation. I'll leave it to the U.S. They'll do that, and we wind up paying for everyone's participation in a treaty. You know, even if they're not allied with the U.S., we still pay for their participation in the treaty. So there are a lot of things like that that I could understand, particularly coming in from the business world, you know, saying, what the heck, why are you paying for 16 countries to participate in this treaty and half of them are fighting you on it? You know, I can see where that seemed strange to me when I was in the State Department. So, so I can see where that's, where those types of issues come up and push a more centered U.S. look out for our own interests first. So there's a line, but we're clearly on sliding towards one side of it.
I want to bring the perspective of academia, not of the real estate mindset.
Real estate.
Yeah. So, you know, a very famous economist spoke about bilateral trade and also regional trade, for that matter, as termites in your furniture, yeah? They're eating your furniture, basically. The problem with this is we have now spaghetti of those. We always had them, to be fair. Absolutely. We always had them. In large part as a result of the policies, literally, of the multilateral trade agreement. Became impossible to do anything at the global level, which is the World Trade Organization. Right? That's the idea of the World Trade Organization, the GATS previously. It's so difficult to have, on the one hand, we want to have everybody to the table. That's the idea of that, being a truly multilateral agreement. At the same time, you have around the table 180 countries, go and find something that everybody can agree on. And the World Trade Organization has this peculiarity that all decisions must be accepted by majority, not by majority, by consensus, which is, so it becomes impossible. So all sorts of other agreements popped up as a result of that, yeah? But then Donald Trump came, yeah, with the real estate mindset, yeah? So that brought to the table something very, very new that we haven't seen before. Yeah. So now we are listening, we are thinking about what best will be to, so that of course increases, but from a purely economic perspective, it's clear that a multilateral agreement is the best because it puts everybody on a playing level field. And then trade really evolves based on the principle of comparative advantage. Otherwise, but that requires that everybody will be willing to give some of its own benefits for the sake of the global benefits, which we're not seeing countries demonstrating. So it's surely not something to celebrate. I can see every country from its own perspective say, why the heck? Why should we do this? That is very consistent with America First and this kind of rhetoric. But it's not. We know that America cannot be successful alone on
unless
its own.
Everyone is.
Yeah, unless everyone is. Not in a world today. Sometimes not sure that Trump really gets this.
So also, if you think about, I think about the world post-Trump and say, okay, so what's the next administration going to be like? Look, the simple reality is that people voted for Trump to break the China shop, right? to break China in Washington, and that's exactly what they got, because that's exactly what he's done. But post-Trump, putting this all back together again, and how does the world lay out? Does it take some of those tendencies to be a little more nationalistic? And say, well, wait a minute, let's ensure these interests are made ABC. I don't think it'll be more extreme than him, but I think less extreme. But I do think that there's, and you see that now in China, U.S.-China trade. You see a Congress united. When has that happened? But Democrats and Republicans actually united in taking China to task on this, which is something that I don't think China is internalized yet. That this is, if you look up on the Congress, there are bills going back and forth every week on dealing with different aspects of China. And that's an extraordinary level of, pace of work that goes on. And those things don't make it through, but just, to address the issues. So I think we've changed America in some senses. Maybe we've changed America in just some thought process. And the next successive administrations will probably have to take a bit of that on to move forward.
Yeah, I think the shape of the post-Trump era is a very, very serious issue that I don't know, to try to stick just to the economic sides of it and not to slip into politics, which is of course an issue in and by itself. I was actually encouraged to see the response of the world for for Trump, because the world didn't. I was worried that it will run into a tit for tat kind of. America is defending itself, so we will defend ourselves too. But the world decided to continue with the TPP -1, yeah. After America withdrew from this. The Paris Accord continues without America. How effective those things are is another question. It's a very serious question. But the fact that countries have not subscribed to this, to the contrary, several very significant trade agreements have been signed after Trump came to power between Canada and the EU and all. So there is a strong commitment in the world outside of America to maintain the principles that we subscribe to in the pre-Trump era. And so this, I think, is encouraging in the sense that in the post-Trump area, there'll be something of that out there that we can join back. How we will be viewed by the rest of the world by then, that's the big question, I think. And how will we build up again the trust that the world had in us? That's the big question. I think that will be the big challenge.
That question of trust, if you could hold on to that for just a second, that question of trust is exactly where I'd like to go, but I want to let all of you know, you wouldn't trust me if I didn't tell you it was about time to collect your cards. So I have a couple of more questions for our panelists, but if you could please start filling out your cards. After those couple of questions, we're going to get to your thoughts and what you'd like to hear from our guests today. So let's stick with this question of trust. Critics of the administration would argue that the administration has done serious damage to the quality of institutions that we have overseeing everything from trade to international arms agreements to pretty much everything. I mean, there's been, go back, Nicholas, to your China shop analogy, that there's been so much broken that we have difficulty finding enough glue to put all of the shards back together. How do you play that aspect of this out? The U.S. participation in either regional or global trade regimes, or is that right now something that people are increasingly turning away from the United States, given the difficulty of predicting our policy and economic trajectory?
I don't think anyone's in a position to turn away from the U.S. I mean, the simple reality is we're such a global powerhouse that I don't think it's like ignoring the big bear in the room. I don't really think you can do that. So the question is going to be, how do they deal with us, right? And that set into fairly standard patterns over decades, right? Well, this is what the U.S. does, this is what we do, and you see it at the negotiating table. Everyone had certain expectations, and as you pointed out, Trump has shattered those expectations. So the question will come, what's next? And all our allies, as well as our enemies, will do as much as they can to influence how that structure is shaped in the next relationship. It's the same thing you see from every foreign ministry. The day after the new administration is in, they're all flooding in to talk to the State Department appointees and the NSC appointees to try and shape the relationship. So this is a fairly standard process, and we'll see this coming from business and from our international partners in the next administration. I think right now, what I find amazing is a lot on the diplomatic circuit will say, you know, Nick, I mean, we know we could be doing more, and you know, and we have to talk and find a way to reason this and move it forward. And my always thoughts are, well, if you know you could be doing more, then why have you not been doing that for the last 10 years? And the reality is because every nation state thinks of themselves first. So trade war, one component of this, but the larger circling component is how the relationships are going to be shaped post-Trump.
So in your sense, really, it's the refocusing of U.S. benefit that survives this breakage in some respects, and it's put together with that rebalanced in some respects.
That's the question. Will that focus still maintain, depending on who comes into office and what their perspectives are? So I'm keenly looking at that to see who comes in, what the rhetoric is like pre, and what you can really tell what the political appointees are like in the first 6 months.
Okay.
to see what the perspectives are.
Great. Lilac, your perspective on the same thing. U.S. more or less credible in global trade
Yeah, I'm not,
post-tariffs.
unfortunately, I cannot be so optimistic. I don't feel that I can subscribe to this optimistic view. I'm much more concerned about, someone said just last night on television, a shake hand by the US was something people could trust, not anymore. And after all, you know, with all the games and sticks that went around the election, Trump came to office in the democratic elections, and I just thought in the world that we could do this. If we've done it once, we could do this again. How could we be trusted at all anymore? And I think that would be the worst legacy that Trump will leave behind him. The position of the US in the world, and the future of all the institutions that, the global institutions that the US was vital in building and establishing, and now is destroying, yeah? Now is the power that is going to destroy them. I know we have the advantage that the US is so strong and nobody can ignore us, yeah? The bear in the room. But how far we can go on this, and people would continue to want to do business with the US, that's true. But if they don't trust us, that will give a very, very different flavor for our position in the world. And particularly, as much I tried not to slip into politics, it becomes difficult, and which Nick alerted us to. The view of democracy around the world, yeah, and particularly that China, that represents a complete alternative to this, is doing so well. Those are the issues that I think will be the most terrible legacy that Trump will leave behind him.
Play this out, if you will. What are the next stages in this process? Right now, we have both sides hunkering down, increasing the tariff regimes on both sides. There are threats of ancillary relationships. Those of us in the academy, for example, particularly shuttering our campuses in the Midwest, where 25 to even 40% of their enrollment is Chinese enrollment. We saw just in August of 2018, when Mohammed bin Salman became a little cross with Canada because of the way that Canada was criticizing Saudi Arabian human rights policy, that all 7,000 Saudi Arabian students in Canada were withdrawn within 24 hours, instantaneously, just taken straight out of that country. And it could happen again. I was actually in Canada at a conference in Toronto when that happened. And I will say that at the university that was hosting the conference, all of the Saudi students were repatriated at participating conference attendees within 24 hours. But that could happen with China, and we're not talking about 7,000, we're talking about tens, hundreds of thousands. It would change the character of higher education. We could go on. Do we wind up with just sort of this continued war of attrition? Is there a pivot point, and how do we do that with face-saving measures on both sides? Do we wind up with a kind of Cold War with a bilateral economic regime, one directed out of Beijing, the other directed out of Washington and Brussels in some rough union? Where do we go here?
Well, I actually, in talking to a couple of members of the negotiating team, I was a little put off at first, if you will. I sort of got the sense that this was going to blow over when we found face-saving measures, and the Chinese would turn around and violate it 24 hours later. So, but it turns out not that way, and that's sort of an interesting component, from the U.S. perspective. They are very, very serious about not only getting a deal, as the president would put it, but something that's enforceable and something that's going to be monitored over time, because they're very, very afraid of a slide back on the part of China, just from historical precedents. So I think this is first step one. The challenge is coaching that in a way that allows Xi Jinping a measure of saving face. And part of that is the president keeping his mouth shut, to be frank. I mean, not tweeting out, we won, those types of things.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Good luck with it.
So it is a component of it. I mean, not that they're going to get those tweets in China, but allowing China a face-saving way out of this, establishing something that's at least long-standing and monitored, where we can reset some of the economic relationship. And from that point on, then it's 10 years. I mean, we're going to have this, for lack of a better term, friction or conflict going on for the next decade or so, while we integrate those governance models and those economic models to, to avoid conflict, to be frank.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that it's a peculiar situation because there seems to be a feeling on both sides that they're both going to win from this for whatever reason. That's a very bad start for negotiation. Yeah, when you believe that you're going to win, why would you go to the table at all? That you have the power in the negotiation. But we know that both are going to lose. Now, I don't know. Nick suggested whose pain will be stronger. I wouldn't take the chance to predict that. But we know that in one way or another, both are going to lose, and the losses will look differently in both directions. The U.S. started it. I don't think that Donald Trump doesn't seem. It's very hard to predict in this Twitter politics what is going next or what will happen next, and it's so kind of on the face of it seems to lack any logic that we can follow. But the U.S. started it, and I don't think that there is an intention to have this as the status quo at all. Yeah, it is really meant. It was intended from the start to put a pressure on China, which is this is not only a U.S. recognition and not only across the board, across the political board in America. It's also in Europe and the rest of the world. So in that regard, we are in a strong position. But so I think it's in the interest, of course, of all countries to settle this down. But I think the U.S. started it, and I think the U.S. does not want to continue this. So, yeah. So it's more the question of what would be the shape of the new settlement, I think, than whether it will continue the way it is. Yeah, it would most likely won't. Most likely it won't.
So just a real quick question for both of you. You see this ending before the 2020 presidential election or no?
Oh, that's a real tough one.
I think yes.
I think that whatever comes out before the 2020 election, I think is just step one, right? I think that they'll sign a deal, but the problems are going to continue. Just two different governance models wanting two different things out of the world, right? So it's going to continue after that. But I will think, I'll say they'll get something before 2020.
So Donald Trump campaigns on his victory in China, and that happens this spring.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, both of you? All right. We have boodles of good questions here. There are some that hang together, but most of them do not. So I'm going to go through the ones that do not first, and then I have a couple of concatenations to do. Does China's authoritarian governance give them a short and or long-term advantage in this contest?
That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I would say, certainly a short-term advantage it gives them because they're decisive. They can move the economy. They can give direction to, they can cut funding and stop a shadow banking system and all those types of things that they can turn on a dime. And they've proven themselves pretty adept in that. So certainly at a short term. A long term with that type of decision-making process, I don't know because it tends to build tensions internally on you're going the wrong direction. And there's nothing worse than taking the blame for going a wrong direction. So internally there's a lot of friction within the regime and that tends to build into paranoia, that tends to build into more aggressive surveillance apparatus. So you don't know where it's going to take it as a longer term thing. I actually worry more about that than I do the short term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lilac, any thoughts on this one? Or?
No, nothing significant. We can move on.
Okay. A related question. Questioner says, I think China is doing well. Does this feeling relate to our young people moving toward a more socialist view? In other words, does China's performance does it feed domestically here the notion that maybe our political institutions are a little bit behind the curve?
I'll be happy to take this one. I think I don't want to eat up the next conference, to eat up into the next conference.
But please feel free. We'll have plenty to talk about.
But it is related. We are seeing a shift to the left in America, but I don't know that this is affected by China so much. I don't think so. But what I do think is that it affects the rest of the world, and that's in the spirit of what I said before. there is an alternative to the US model that is so powerful, so successful, at the time that the US looks like a joke for the rest of the world, what's happening to the US, and what happened to US election, and what happened to US democracy. Our elections are manipulated. So how can we, when then we talk about elections in Africa are not being done fairly? Our entire system is so manipulated, and there is an alternative that, at least if you look at the bottom line, is doing much better than we do, and very, very attractive alternative. But this is an authoritarian regime. And it's a very huge outlier. We haven't seen anything like that in history, and we are unlikely to see another one. There is a combination of things here that would not repeat itself in other countries. We know that. But those countries do not seem to know that. I happened to be during the election in Africa, during my sabbatical in Nigeria. And I could get the sense of how people in Africa see our system, our entire system. They told me straight, we looked up to you for our democracy. And look what you do. What role model are you? Whom are we now to look up to? So China comes as the natural alternative. And I think that's the worry, because these are here at stake, all the values that we nurture so much, like freedom of speech and liberty and everything that we subscribe to from our heart. But yeah, China doesn't.
That's funny, because I have professors from Nigeria who tell me, you know what's wrong with you Americans, Nick? You constantly export democracy. You need to stop that, because it's not applicable everywhere.
No, it doesn't. You don't have enough of it. Not exported.
I tend to think that it's not the case that Americans are taking their views from China. I actually think I would make an argument stronger that it's from Europe.
Yeah.
That
right.
the socialist,
I agree.
economies in Europe are far more factors in influencing
Yes.
America than China is.
I'd love to stay here and take this back to Africa, particularly where we're going to see the vast majority of net population growth over the next 100 years. But I want to get to your questions first, and we'll go there, and if we have time, we'll come back to that issue. One question wants to know what the WTO has or hasn't done to address U.S. criticisms of Chinese mercantile and IP policies.
Yeah, in short, as far as I know, nothing. And the U.S. has highlighted, I believe, 5 different areas that China violated the WTO. They're supposed to produce X number of laws, to do it in multiple languages, to have a fair and independent judicial system, all these elements that they agreed to in the WTO and have done. They haven't responded to it, and the WTO has done nothing about it.
There are a lot of things that China does, or China is blamed of doing, that are not regulated by the World Trade Organization. This is a feature of political trade policy of many countries, that they find ways, they find their holes in the system of the World Trade Organization that are not regulated. And by the nature of the regulatory system, it always comes after the reality. It regulates things that of the past. So, for example, exchange rate manipulations are not explicitly regulated by the World Trade Organization. So China does not break any World Trade Organization rules by manipulating their exchange rate. Whether they do it or not is a big question in itself, and I'm not sure at all that Trump has a point on this. So yeah, so I think a lot of what they do really falls into those holes. Yeah.
We have a lot of questions, perhaps 10 in the stack here, where people would like to know if human rights should be a factor in these questions at both the firm level. How do firms do business in the PRC, and yet stay true to the sort of U.S. style of political expression? This was, of course, most recently flaring up with the Houston Rockets and the tweet about support for Hong Kong. So many people have asked some version of the following question, which I'm going to ball up into one. Should Hong Kong change the way that firms think about engaging in China? Can firms engage in China and still be true to their values and to their economic self-interest, given some of the devolution of productive capacity and IP that's built into many of those contracts? How do these things play into what we should be thinking about at a policy level in the U.S.?
I'm going to say, I'm not much of an Occupy Wall Street type, but that said, this is probably one of the greatest travesties that I've seen in my lifetime on American industry, looking for its commercial interests far over human rights and far over even the interests of our own nation. And I mean, even things, academic institutions. MIT had a joint development program for facial recognition with SenseTime, the #1 contractor for China's Ministry of Public Security in putting all the, all the facial recognition programs throughout China for an oppressive nation state. Got it. I got there's money to be made, and from not only our U.S. businesses but academia as well. But we've got to recognize, and it in some senses come down to your personal friendships, right? There are people that you're friends with, and you are because you have a certain joint value system. You have a certain recognition in that, and here we have a complete contrast. Okay to do business, okay to to work with them, but we've got to recognize at the end of the day, self-interests here are not the same. And theirs is a particularly brutal, authoritarian, digital authoritarian nation state. So that just has to be kept in mind, and in the minds and souls, if there are, of American corporate and academia.
I think that the issue of the inconsistency between our values and those of the values of the countries in which our companies increasingly invest is an issue that has become very, very thorny. And the more countries that do not exactly subscribe to our set of norms join the world and offer business opportunities, the thornier this issue becomes. China is not, it's just one of them, but it was a non-issue when international business took place between the US, Canada, and Western Europe, yeah? We all subscribe to the same set of norms and rules, but when companies go elsewhere, we mentioned before the advantage of China in Africa. US companies were not more active there, in large part because of violation of human rights and many other values that we are not willing to sacrifice. I think this is an issue that is hunting our companies around the world and is very, very complicated and a delicate one. It's hard to let China go, but Google, for example, did that. We see companies dealing, fewer and fewer of them are doing that today. Yeah, there are more, because their business opportunities are too big to let go. At the same time, they don't. If they are there, they have to oblige by the rule of the local community. And when it is the rules, it's easy. But a lot of it is ethics and it's norms, and they get a lot. It's an ongoing struggle because they are criticized for what they do in those countries back here in the U.S. more than not in those countries, but back here in the U.S. And the damage for their business is back here in the U.S. by the bad publicity that this does for them. It's really one of the most difficult issues, I think, that multinational companies confront with today. And it's not at all a Chinese thing. It's really around the world.
Okay. We have two questions on the Democrats, and I'm going to answer one, and then I'll let you two answer the other one. The first is, what is the range of positions the Democrats have taken, and are those positions principled or expedient? And the answer is there are too many Democrats to even begin answering that question. And number two is that nobody has taken a very detailed position. If Sherrod Brown decided to run, the answer would be yes, but otherwise no, and they won't, because right now there's no way to satisfy both the financial services base of the party and the labor base of the party without tying yourself in knots. So they're not going to do that until they're forced sometime in the summer when we get closer to a nominee. So the other one is yours, and that is, do you expect the trade war and tariffs to continue after, if a Democratic nominee takes office in 2021? And do you think the U.S. would seek at that time to rejoin the TPP, removing the -1 and putting it back up to the original number?
You want to go first on that? No, as far as the TPP, I would guess there'll be more of a movement. Let me answer. There'll be more of a movement towards multilateralism. Okay, that's going to, assuming a Democratic candidate got in,
Right.
I think we'll return somewhat to an era of multilateralism. That will come back. Whether it'll manifest itself specifically in the U.S. joining the TPP, because the problem with the TPP and the way they move forward was that it had already passed through the Diet in Japan and several other regulatory and legislative bodies in other countries, so they really couldn't turn around and make the changes the U.S. asked for. That was the problem with it. They said, you know what, we've already passed this through our system. Had it been a year earlier, 6 months earlier, it might have been modified, for the U.S. new interests, if you will. So what will happen after that, some multilateral regimes will come out from the economic front. So that's about where I think it goes for that.
Yeah, I think we said already. I don't have anything new to add to this.
What was the first part of the question again?
Well, the first part, I've already put it down, but the first part of the question was, do you think that the tariffs continue and then rejoining the TPP?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we spoke about
Right.
this already.
Yeah, if not tariffs, certainly more actions.
Yeah.
Okay. A couple of questioners want to know your opinion of China's cultural policy in the United States. That has excited a good deal of controversy on college campuses through institutions such as Confucius Institutes, which we have on this campus, and we're actually quite proud of. But that has not been the universal response.
I
Does
think,
it play in here in any way?
well, yeah. So in China, there is a perspective, and you can understand what almost a 5,000-year-old civilization, that it's a civilization, it's not just a nation state, right? So Chinese abroad are very much looked at as part of Mother China, as is a very, very frequent term we hear. So there is a very concerted effort on the part of the Chinese government through the United Front Works Department, several other entities, to monitor and control those elements, particularly that have relationships back in China. So, and they do this through quasi-government bodies, liaison bureaus, friendship societies, various institutes, and in some ways pretty hard-handed and blatant. You'll recall just within the last couple of weeks that one guy was arrested in I guess for San Jose or near in California, driving around in an exact copy of a Chinese Ministry of Public Security and its the FIST units, right? So they're counterterrorism units. That he was driving around in a car which was an exact copy of them to the make and model, right? With all Chinese characters on it, Chinese logo on it, for all the things, and driving around in Chinese neighborhoods. And despite the fact that he was arrested by the local police, for impersonating a peace officer, it's actually being looked at now and investigated, I can say, as a Foreign Agents Registration Act, doing it on behalf of the Chinese government. Same thing in Australia, right? Same thing, a second case that they're looking at in California as well. So this just gives you the type of mentality, the reach. You know what? We're going to scare any Chinese citizens who are potentially supporting Hong Kong, or any Chinese overseas who are potentially supporting Hong Kong, with the idea that we know who you are, we know where you are, we're sending people around. Otherwise, what type of nutcases, buy an Audi to make it look like a Chinese police car in California, right? That's your alternative thought line there. But it does give you the outreach and the mentality to do that. And it's not only in the United States, but it is globally.
I think I see this as part of China, the Confucius institutions and all the schools to teach Chinese Mandarin and all that, as part of China's attempt to create a soft power around the world, to increase its influence via soft power. And I think they're taking a page from America in large part, but they do it as everything else with Chinese in Chinese flavor. Yeah, so do it in their own way. Yeah, which would not be ours. But the idea that you can, America was really the first nation in the world to become a world global power without any military power, entirely by the power of its ideas. That we have never seen this before. England conquered the world. Became colonized the entire world. America has hardly done anything of that. It was entirely by the power of its ideas. That's, I think, the source of power of America, and that's the major thing that Donald Trump seems to be bearing now. And China is taking a page from that, but again, in a very Chinese flavor, as Nick described so vividly. So, yeah.
So Joe Nye talks about this actually in U.S. Soft Power Vice, what he termed as China's sharp power. So, the U.S. did it by attraction. Hey, this is our system, this is capitalism, this is democracy, this is freedom, and drew so much of the world towards it for those very values that we hold as ours. China, in contrast, does it with a lot of coercion, a lot of secrecy, a lot of threats, and some mix of cultural, how wonderful Chinese culture is. So he actually puts that in a category of what he calls sharp power as opposed to soft power.
Thank you so much. We have other questions, but I'm afraid we have no more time. So join me, please, if you will, in thanking Nicholas Eftimiades and Lilac Knockham for joining us here today.